Welcome to Fun with Annuities, where every single week I welcome a celebrity guest expert that can help you maximize Chapter 2 of your life. Listen, learn, laugh, and love every minute of the most unique financial podcast on the planet. Let's get to it. Welcome to Fun with Annuities, the number one annuity podcast on the planet. I'm your host, Stan, the Annuity Man, America's annuity agent. I want to welcome everyone listening to us on all the podcast platforms. And also remember, I have two YouTube channels. One, Stan, the Annuity Man YouTube channel, which has up to 400 product videos that are very short and informative and non-salesy about annuity products. And then this podcast, Fun with Annuities, has its own YouTube channel, where you can go and view the guest and myself interacting and the facial expressions and all that good stuff. But I don't want to waste any time because today's guest is a true superstar. Her name is Christine Benz, and let me tell you a little bit about her. She is the Director of Personal Finance for Morningstar. You know what Morningstar is, and a senior columnist for Morningstar.com as well. Her primary focus is on retirement and portfolio planning for individual investors, which is the reason that you're listening. She also co-hosts a podcast for Morningstar. It's called The Long View. I encourage you to listen to that because they bring in people and interview them, thought leaders in the investing and personal finance space. A couple things about Christine that you need to know. In 2020, Barron's named her to its inaugural list of the 100 most influential women in finance, and she also appeared on that list in 2021 as well, and she's going to be on that list for infinity. In 2021, Barron's also named her as one of the 10 most influential women in wealth management. You can just probably remove the women. She's probably one of the most 10 influential people in wealth management. She's also the author of a book called The 30-Minute Money Solutions, a step-by-step guide to managing your finances, which I encourage you to read. She also co-authored a book called Morningstar's Guide to Mutual Funds, which is the 5-star strategies for success. That's kind of the underlying title, which, it's been a bestseller since 2003, and she put out the second edition and helped do that in 2005. Pretty interesting background from an educational standpoint. Christine holds a bachelor's of education, a bachelor's degree in political science and Russian and East European studies from the University of Illinois. I think that's really fascinating. She's also a board member of the John C. Bogle Center for Financial Literacy and is also a member of what's called the Alpha Group, which consists of the top thought leaders in wealth management across the country. Now, when she has free time, which sounds like she doesn't have a ton, but when she does, she works with underprivileged women to improve their understanding of personal finance concepts, which is fantastic. Now, on my site at theannuityman.com, we are going to have links to her archives that are on Morningstar.com where you can read. I mean, she's a great writer. You can read her stuff. And we're also going to have a link to her podcast replays as well. I could keep going. I mean, I synopsized the bio, believe me. But I want to welcome Christine Benz to Fun with Annuities. Welcome, Christine.
Stan, thank you so much. Gosh, that was such a nice introduction. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here today.
Well, you've earned it, obviously. So let's just jump right in. You're very, very passionate about retirement portfolio planning. What are some of the reasons that you're so passionate about that? I know that you have told me that. I wrote them all down, but I want you to tell the people why this is such a driving force for you on a daily basis.
Sure. Well, I would start with saying that it's personal for me because I have helped older adults in my life through this process. My parents, my in-laws, both my husbands and my dads have since passed away, and my mom has passed away as well. We still have my mother-in-law, but I've helped them through this process, and through that really began to recognize that retirement decumulation is so much more complicated than it was a couple of decades ago, certainly 30 or 40 years ago, where you have more and more people like myself who are retiring without the benefit of pensions. More and more folks will be coming into retirement without a pension. But then you also have this very low yield environment. And that has driven some retirees, especially to generalize a little bit, some of the older retirees tend to gravitate to very income-centric portfolios. They quite reasonably want to try to subsist on whatever yield their portfolio kicks off. The odd thing about that today is that if you were to structure a portfolio strictly for yield, you end up with a pretty risky portfolio. So there are the challenges of the current environment. Another reason I'm attracted to this space is that I am involved in financial education generally. And one thing I know from having worked with various groups is that people are receptive to learn at point of purchase, sort of when they have to make a decision about something. So, if it's a 401k investor, if you give them a little bit of information about how to make a sane allocation within a 401k plan, they'll be good to go and they'll listen to you. Same goes for retirees. They need to figure this out. If they are getting to retirement, they need to figure out how to extract cash flows from their portfolios. They need to figure out how much they can safely take out without overspending. So they're incredibly receptive. I speak to these groups of retirees and they are so engaged. There are no sleepers in the audience when I talk about retirement planning because they really have a need to know this information. And then I guess another reason why I like kind of being in the public space to talk about these issues is that I think that unfortunately there's a little bit of a tendency in the financial services industry to make things more complicated than they need to be. And so I like being a voice of reason in terms of saying it doesn't have to be really complicated. You can do this in a slightly simpler way. So those are some of the highlights of why I like being in this space. And I guess just on another personal note, I know that cognitive decline is a major issue among older adults. We experienced that with my dad later in life, and I was so happy that I was his investment buddy during his later years, and it was really pretty seamless for us, where I was able to take over my parents' investment plans. I know a lot of older adults don't necessarily have that trusted adult child who understands investments. So I like to do education about this, and I like to help people create a plan that could effectively manage itself if need be for a time or, for the rest of their lives. So those are just some of the highlights of why I like to talk about this area so much.
When you say the word decumulation, we live in a world where we've been taught accumulation. So when you say the word decumulation, I think a lot of people instinctively reflex, because in essence, that says to them is, my money is going to decrease. Do me a favor and do the listeners and viewers a favor and tell them that decumulation is okay and why.
It is. And, I do think that many retirees do have that reflexive desire to not touch their principal, to try to live off of yield. But I guess that my point is, and the philosophy that I bring to this is that if you create the best possible portfolio that you can with a sane mix of risk and reward characteristics, that portfolio doesn't know whether your withdrawals are coming from income or they're coming from selling appreciated securities. What matters is that you are not taking out too much, and that you're also maintaining that portfolio's risk-reward characteristics as the years go by. That's really the name of the game, and I wouldn't get overly hung up on never touching principal, because sometimes touching principal is actually the right thing to do. So right now, for example, we've had this tremendous run in the equity market. My view has been that if you're retired and you're looking at what are still very low yields today, your cash flows for at least the next couple of years are hiding in plain sight in terms of harvesting some of those appreciated equity securities, putting that money into safe investments, probably cash, short-term bonds, but essentially setting aside your cash flows for the next couple of years. And simultaneously, you are reducing risk in your investment portfolio. So my view is that it's perfectly okay to pull from those appreciated positions. In fact, that very much should be part of your decumulation plan, and you shouldn't worry too much about doing so if in the end you're able to maintain your portfolio and maintain a sustainable withdrawal rate and make sure that your money lasts throughout your retirement years.
That's a great explanation of decumulation, because I think that's almost a curse word with a lot of people, because they remember Jimmy Carter yields, and I always
Right.
tell people, Jimmy Carter's building houses in Georgia. Hopefully he's still alive at the time of this taping. But you're not going to probably see those yields anymore. Those 12% CDs. So that's tough for people. Even though if you look at the 10-year Treasury equivalents across the globe, we're still pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
But high right now feels low
Right.
from a yield standpoint. I was doing some research on your writings, and it was fascinating. You had an article, and I've seen you speak on this, on some of the blind spots that people run into and people miss when it comes to retirement. And I think this is so important because, with over 10,000 baby boomers hitting the age of 65 every single day. I mean, it's a demographic tidal wave. That's what I call it.
Right.
What are some of these blind spots that people need to be aware of? And again, you don't have to write it down, everybody, especially if you're driving or on that treadmill. I mean, we'll have these replays up, but kind of go through the blind spots. I think I was writing them down. I think you had around 6. You might have more. Can you cover those?
Sure. So I have a presentation that's kind of structured along these lines. And one of them that I start out the presentation with is retirement date risk. And I think that that's oftentimes not discussed very much. But the bottom line is that even though we might have this what we think is a very well-conceived plan of when we might expect to retire, in reality, when we look at the data, and my colleague David Blanchett, who I think is kind of one of the leading lights in retirement research, has looked at people's stated anticipated retirement dates and when they actually retired. And what his research shows is that we're not very good at this. We tend to overestimate our ability to continue working or our desire to continue working. We might say, well, I plan to retire when I'm 69 or something like that. When we look at the data, we see that there's a gap, that people oftentimes are retiring earlier than they expected to. And there are a variety of reasons why this might be. We know that ageism is a thing in the workplace.
Yes.
We know that older adults sometimes encounter health issues, or their spouse encounters health issues that makes it difficult for them to continue
or
working.
their parents. Yeah.
Or their parents.
Right.
So a lot of different forces can work against your desire to work longer specifically. So we see that there's typically a gap where people are often retiring earlier than expected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a risk factor for the size of the portfolio. It depends on the size of the portfolio, but if you are over withdrawing over a longer time period, that is a risk factor. So that's one of the key blind spots that I would point to. And to me, that really argues for thinking through, well, if I'm not able to continue working until that anticipated retirement date, what's my backup plan? What's my plan B? And I think it's worthwhile for all of us, really throughout our careers, to be thinking about, well, if whatever I'm doing doesn't work for me due to workplace issues or lifestyle issues or health issues, could I continue to earn some sort of income in the meantime? And so I that is sort of a piece of counsel that I would bring to this. And also just be aware that you don't have as much control over that retirement date as you might wish to believe you have.
So is there a strategy or strategies that you would tell people to do specifically if, and you covered it a little bit about, hey, I'm going to retire at 69 or 65. It's tough, especially because you don't know where markets are going to go or interest rates are going to go. How do you advise people to be flexible with that retirement date risk planning?
Well, so I think thinking about what your backup plan is, certainly nurturing your human capital and making sure that you are continuing to prove yourself valuable to your organization throughout your career. I think we've all, especially those of us who are home office workers, we've all sort of had a very quick ramp up into being savvy about all different matters of technology that we've all had to be our own IT staff. I think that's been great. So continuing to nurture your human capital, also thinking hard about insurance planning. A real wild card is if you are pre-Medicare and somehow separated from your employer provided health care earlier than you anticipated.
Right.
Thinking through your plan for that is absolutely essential. So those are some of the key things from sort of a plan aspect to help protect yourself.
One of the risk and blind spots was sequence of return risk that you mentioned. And when people typically hear that, they've heard it before, but can you dumb it down? I always tell people, if you can't explain it to a 9-year-old, no offense to 9-year-olds, you either shouldn't buy it or it's not simplified enough. Simplify it down, sequence of return risk for the people out there that aren't really sure what that is.
Right. It's a concept that retirement researchers talk about. And basically the risk is that you may retire into a not so great market environment. So when we think about the market environment today, what do we know? Well, we know that yields are pretty low. We've talked about that a little bit. We also know that equity valuations, because we have had this long running bull market, equity valuations, stock prices aren't what they once were. And so it's risky if you come into retirement and you do encounter a weak market environment for whatever reason. Inflation, I think, is potentially a consideration today as well. The risk is that if you over withdraw during that period that the market is down, whether that's 6 months or whether it's 2.5 years, whatever, if you're taking too much from your portfolio during that time, and that time occurs in the early years of your retirement, well, that leaves less of your portfolio in place to recover and to rebound when stocks eventually do. So it's a big risk factor for new retirees. If you're an older retiree, if you're someone who is 80 and you've been retired 15 years, well, guess what? You've won. You have retired into a pretty good market environment. It's the new retirees who I think need to be cautious and need to be thinking about, well, what's my plan in that instance? How do I structure my plan so that I can protect myself against that possibility of retiring into a weak market?
And its sequence of return risk is something you obviously can't control, similar to dovetailing into one of the other blind spots, which is the low yield environment that we're in, that a lot of the savers and the CD buyers are scratching their heads because the yield isn't there, the coupons aren't there. No one knows where interest rates are going to go, including Christine Benz. She'll be the first one to tell you that. She'll pound the table and tell you that. But what's your advice for people in a environment that's low, and it doesn't seem like the government's painted themselves into a little bit of a corner printing all this money. So raising interest rates, they're going to raise those payments on themselves. So it'd be like me and you raising our mortgage rate, right?
Right.
What's your advice to people here other than grin and bear it, right? What is it? What do you tell people?
Well, I think it's worthwhile to rethink why you hold safer assets in your portfolio and why you just sort of decide to accept lower yields. The key reason is that, yes, cash and high quality bonds are there to provide you with yield, but they're also there to be the ballast for your equity portfolio. They are there to be the assets that you could spend through if you come into retirement and you encounter a weak equity market. You have set yourself up with safe assets that you could spend through before you need to touch the equity assets. Right. So I think sort of rethinking the role of safe assets, that income production is less of their value today. That may change in the future. Right now, their key value is safety and providing that cushion of some sort of an equity market shock. So that would be my advice. My advice absolutely would be not to gravitate to very high risk, high yield securities as a big portion of your portfolio. You might have them around the margins, like 5 or 10% in high yield bonds or emerging markets bonds, but definitely not the main course, because when we look at assets like that, whether junk bonds or emerging markets bonds, what we see is very equity-like performance. We see them behave in sympathy with the equity market. That's not what you're going for this portion of your portfolio. You're going for safety, and you have to contend with and accept very low yields on offer today.
Which leads us to the gorilla in the room and your blind spot that you list sometimes in your presentations as number 4, which is inflation.
Yes.
Which people are very tuned into, because even though you hear government officials sometimes say that there really isn't inflation, if you're buying lumber and if you're buying food and if you're buying gas, and you're saying, wait a minute, I think there might be. Obviously, in the annuity world, as you know, annuity companies don't give inflation increases away. They just ratchet down the payments if you're buying lifetime income. That doesn't mean it's good or bad, but that also means that there's no perfect solution to inflation, just really bad sales pitches, as I say. What's your thought and advice for people to think about, address, and strategize around inflation?
Yeah, it's a huge question today, Stan. And a year ago, I wouldn't have been so concerned with it, but we are beginning to see inflation tick up. And I think, the big question is whether this is just sort of a natural part of this emergence from the lockdown that we've been in for the better part of a year, for more than a year. But I think from a retirement standpoint, you think about protecting against inflation in a few different ways. First, you think about your own spending patterns and do a little bit of research, a little bit of reconnaissance on what your spending has looked like, what categories you tend to spend on. One thing we know about older adults is that they spend more on healthcare than the general population. We have historically seen healthcare inflation rise at a faster clip than the general inflation rate. So just take a close look at your spending habits. In some areas, you may be a loser, like healthcare. In other areas, like energy costs, you may be a winner because you're not commuting, you're not driving as much as you were when you were working. So kind of just think about your spending categories, and then think about your income sources in retirement. So if you are on the really positive end of the spectrum from the standpoint of inflation, and you have sort of a pension that provides you full inflation protection, and that pension is supplying you with all the income that you need, well, you're in great shape. And then at the other end of the spectrum would be the retiree who doesn't have any of those inflation protected income sources and has a really safe portfolio that he or she is pulling from for all of the income. Well, that's someone who's really vulnerable because their purchasing power is just going to be gobbled up by inflation. Most of us in retirement fall somewhere in between those two poles, where we have some inflation insulation. If we're getting Social Security, for example, we might not agree that the little increase that we get on our Social Security benefit is sufficient, but that portion of our income is inflation protected. It's really the portfolio that we need to concern ourselves with to make sure that that portion of our withdrawals is in some fashion insulated against inflation. So when we think about protecting a portfolio against inflation, we think about a couple of key categories. One would be to make sure that you have stocks in your portfolio, because even though stocks aren't any sort of direct hedge against inflation, when we look at the asset classes with the ability to out-earn inflation over time, stocks very much fit the bill. Whether they will do so over the next couple of years or the next 5 years, open question. But over longer time periods, we see a pretty good ability for stocks to beat inflation. So you want to make sure you have stocks. But on the fixed income side, I think it's also worth looking at a category called Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, or sometimes called TIPS. And TIPS are issued by the Treasury, but they have a little bit of spin on the ball in terms of offering an inflation adjustment to your principal value, which in turn affects your yield when inflation trends up. So my colleagues at Morningstar Investment Management put together asset allocation programs. Within a person's fixed income allocation, they typically recommend, a retired person's fixed income allocation, they typically recommend like a 20 to 30% allocation to Treasury inflation protected securities. The idea is that you are protecting the purchasing power on that portion of your portfolio. Some retirees might say, well, why not just have my whole fixed income allocation in TIPS? Well, the risk is that that's not very diversified. So even though Treasury bonds and Treasury inflation protected securities are the most credit worthy bonds that you can find, they tend to be somewhat interest rate sensitive. So you'd probably want to diversify to include some corporate bonds, some agency-backed bonds, some other securities to ensure that your portfolio, your fixed income portfolio, is a little bit better diversified. But those are some of the key asset classes I would think about. Some of the other asset classes that people might add would include things like commodities, or commodities tracking exchange traded funds, precious metals, either an ETF like GLD or perhaps some of the precious metals mining
Mm-hmm.
companies. And here I would recommend owning some type of a mutual fund or an ETF, exchange
Sure.
traded fund that does this. And finally, real estate, I think, is another asset class that historically has shown some ability to protect against inflation. And the reason is pretty intuitive, that when rates are increasing and as a REIT owner, you're able to participate and benefit from that. Well, that's also the time when inflation is typically running up broadly. So those are some sort of non-core assets that I might think about. But again, keeping them to very small positions because they're quite volatile as standalone holdings. You definitely don't want to have giant positions in a category like commodities or precious metals.
It's all about allocation and proportion, and you preach that with your writings and what you've done for decades at Morningstar. One of the kind of the new gorillas in the room, and I read a couple of recent articles that you have written on this topic, is healthcare and long-term care. And obviously, again, the demographic tidal wave of people hitting age 65 and we're living longer, et cetera. Tell people why this is important, why long-term care coverage and that transfer of risk type coverage they should be looking at. Why should they do that?
Such an important topic, Stan. And I'll just start with talking about healthcare expenses in retirement more broadly. Fidelity annually puts out these estimates of what a 65-year-old couple who is retiring will spend over, I believe it's like a 25 or 30-year period. And the most recent information that I saw was roughly $300,000. So these are various premiums that they're paying. These are out-of-pocket expenses and so forth. So even after you're covered by Medicare, you still have some healthcare costs. And what we see when we look at those healthcare costs is they're not linear. They're not the same year by year. They tend to trend up later in retirement. So Fidelity's $300,000 estimate does not include long-term care costs. That's just all the other stuff that people pay. So I think it's worth staying mindful about those costs and certainly making sure that you are incorporating them into your budget and into your spending plan, but also recognize that there's tremendous variability in those costs. So giving some hard thought to what your health situation is, what your spouse's health situation is. Where you live is a big determinant of your out-of-pocket healthcare outlays. So if you live in a high-cost part of the country, if you live in Chicago or LA or some other city where costs are high at large, you'll pay more for healthcare. If you live in a less urban area, you'll tend to pay less. So give some thought to that. Make sure you're factoring it into your budget. Also, long-term care is the real wild card in my view for many retirement plans. In fact, when I'm out speaking, if there is a topic that will send the room up for grabs because it gives people so much angst, it's this. People wonder how to contend with long-term care costs. So these are costs that are not covered by Medicare. They are costs that many older adults incur if they encounter cognitive decline, or even if they just simply start needing help around the home to make meals or whatever it might be, to help them shower. A lot of situations can occur. The idea is that these costs are not going to be covered by Medicare, nor will they be covered by your supplemental policy that you may have purchased.
Right.
You need to create a plan for what these long-term care costs might be and also how you might contend with them. And so it's super tricky because I often speak to retirees who thought they were doing exactly the right thing by purchasing long-term care insurance. And what we've seen is that the marketplace is pretty troubled, that unfortunately these policies that were priced 20 years ago did not adequately incorporate long-term care usage. And they didn't incorporate this very low yield environment that we find ourselves in, which has afflicted insurance companies as well, because they can't really earn much on the premiums that they've been able to take in if they want to be able to make their policy payments. So that's the troubling part of this. The easy answer 20 years ago might have been to purchase some sort of a long-term care policy. People have seen their premiums really increase to account for the fact that it's a pretty troubled marketplace. So I would really, when thinking about this, when approaching this risk, I would kind of think about my own situation and sort myself into one of three groupings. So for people who don't have a lot in retirement assets, they will probably, to the extent that they have long-term care needs, they will be covered by Medicaid, and Medicaid is the largest payer of long-term care expenses in the US. Many people end up needing Medicaid provided care. So for people without a lot of wealth, that will be their strategy. They probably shouldn't overly worry about it. Now, it's worth mentioning that you need to essentially deplete most of your assets, which could leave your spouse needing some sort of financial assistance in the meantime, but that's sort of that group. And then at the other extreme would be very wealthy people who, when they look at their portfolios, they have more than enough to last during their lifetimes, and they can also cover an extended long-term care need comfortably out of their assets. I'm sometimes asked, well, how much would I need to have in assets to put me in this other area where I'm self-funding long-term care expenses? And my point is, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you a dollar amount because I don't know what you're spending from your portfolio.
Right.
If you have, a $2 million portfolio, but you are spending too heavily from it, well, you probably should have long-term care insurance. So get some guidance on that. If you're a higher net worth person with a sizable portfolio, make sure that you do have adequate assets to self-fund long-term care. And then my view is, if you have determined that you have enough, go ahead and segregate those assets from your spendable assets to ensure that you're not considering them part of your spending plan. If you're a young retiree and that's your plan to self-fund long-term care, segregate those assets. You'd probably want to invest them pretty aggressively because the chance of having a long-term care need earlier in your life is pretty low. And then that middle group is the group who I think is the best candidate for some sort of insurance product to help insure against this risk. You can still buy long-term care policies, but increasingly what have come on strong are these hybrid type
asset-based. Yeah, they call them asset-based coverage.
Yes, which Stan, you know more about these types of products than I do, but it's typically either a life insurance policy or an annuity with a long-term care rider bolted on. And those can be attractive options, especially in my opinion, for people who had life insurance and they had that need to protect their dependents when their dependents were younger. But if they're older and they've accumulated sufficient assets, life insurance may no longer be a big concern for them, but they can switch into one of these asset-based policies to help protect themselves. And they can do what's called a 1035 exchange. Get some tax guidance on this before embarking on this. But these policies, these products can be pretty interesting in some situations. Maybe not perfect, but something to consider and something to get some unbiased advice about. You would definitely want to engage the services of some sort of a financial planner or advisor who is not selling these products to help assist you in doing your due diligence, because the products can be a little complicated in my experience. The hybrid
they certainly
products
can. We had I had a guest on recently. His name is Jack Lindenberg. He's arguably the top long-term care expert in the country. He's also a lawyer as a background, but he talked about these asset-based long-term care solutions, which covers the biggest fear for most people, which is, what if I don't use what if I don't use the coverage? These asset-based policies protect the principal, which would go to your beneficiaries if you didn't use it, which is the biggest fear of traditional long-term care, which is I pay in, and it's, it goes poof when I die. With these newer policies, that circumvents and gets rid of that fear, even though you have the coverage. So, I would encourage people, if you can go to my site at theannuityman.com and re-listen to that podcast with Jack Lindenberg, because he's going to dovetail what Christine's talking about, but go into detail about those specific products, which leads me to the sixth blind spot, which is where annuities can fit in, because they're the only product on the planet that can provide lifetime income. And it's a blind spot that you talk about. It's called longevity risk. Can you go into that?
Yeah, this is a good news story in so many ways, that we see life expectancy gains, especially among higher income adults,
Right.
where, the probability of, if you're part of a married couple, the probability of one of you making it to age 95
Hmm.
is quite high. I don't know off the top of my head specifically what it is, but
Right.
it's I think it's 1 in 3. And when you further sort of subdivide that group by higher income adults, we unfortunately, in my opinion, we see longevity very much correlated with level of wealth. And so we do know that higher income, higher net worth people tend to live longer. So
Right.
you need to protect yourself against that possibility. And there are a few different ways to do that. I would say that right out of the box, if you're thinking about doing that, you want to make sure that your money lasts. Well, you certainly want to make sure that you are looking at non-portfolio income sources with an eye to maximizing those lifetime payouts. So at the top of the list would be to make sure that you're making smart decisions about Social Security claiming. And Stan, I don't know if you agree with this assertion, but I believe that that should really be job one before you look at an annuity, just to make sure that you are getting
I agree with
the
that. I agree with that.
highest
And
possible.
the reason I agree with that, just to interject real quick, is people always say, well, I hate all annuities. And I say, well, you already own one.
Right.
And it's the best inflation annuity on the planet. And they go, no, I'll never own an annuity and Social Security. So I totally agree that
Yeah.
that's the foundational annuity that you need to make the best decision on, and seek someone out, not an agent or advisor, but someone who really specializes in Social Security type planning so that you can make that decision for your situation, because there's no perfect answer across the board. It's customizable to what you're trying to do and achieve. I would think you would agree with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're part of a married couple, I think that decision making is even more important.
Hmm.
One free tool I would note, Stan, is from my friend Mike Piper, who
Okay.
has a website called Open Social Security. It's a free
Good.
website. There's been kind of a cottage industry in these Social
Yeah.
Security calculators. Mike's is all free, and it's very rigorous. Mike is a CPA and a Social Security expert. So I would urge your listeners to give that tool a trial run, because it's an absolutely terrific tool, and it helps you include different variables that you don't necessarily see everywhere, so you can haircut your potential benefits. If you're a younger person, for example, and you're worried, well, there might be changes
Right.
to Social Security down the line, you can factor that in. You can also use different actuarial tables that factor in different health situations. So if you think that you will be an especially long-lived retiree, so you can take a look at that. So I would urge people to check that out.
What's
But
that site again?
it's called Open Social Security,
So
and
open,
it's an
open
open
social
source,
security, open social
open source.
security.com, I guess.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, good. We'll list that on our site as well. But getting back to longevity,
Yeah.
and that longevity risk, Social Security, big one you got to plan for. And what I call this is the income floor. What is your income floor? What is the money that's coming into your account that's going to hit every single month that will take care of you in what I call chapter 2 of your life? Chapter 1 is accumulation. Chapter 2 is decumulation and going and living your lifestyle. Um, where do you see annuities get a really bad rap, but they are the only product that can provide income as long as you're breathing. And I've seen you speak about immediate annuities and the sister product, deferred income annuities, and also QLACs, which are deferred income annuities for IRAs. Do you encourage people to look at those? And it's okay if you say you don't, because annuities aren't for everybody. I'm the first one to say that. How does those transfer of risk lifetime income products fit into your portfolio planning?
Yeah, I do think that an annuity can be a good fit for someone who has taken the steps to look at what Social Security will pay them.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that there's a gap in terms of fulfilling
Right.
their basic living expenses, I think that an annuity can be perfectly appropriate. Unfortunately, as you know better than anyone, Stan, annuities are incredibly complicated. We were doing our podcast with Carrie Pector, who
Sure.
is head of the Retirement Income Journal,
Sure.
and
Good
Carrie
friends with
said,
Carrie. Mm-hmm.
yeah, he made the point that the word annuity is almost useless, because the products under the annuity umbrella are so incredibly varied
There's
at
many
this
of them.
point.
Yeah. You can't
Yes.
say you hate all annuities unless you want to say I hate all restaurants, because it just, there's so many types. The annuity industry has done a very poor job of explaining what they are and what they can do and what they solve for. Primarily, it's either principal protection or income for life, one of those two. I can solve for legacy and long-term care. My acronym I use is PIL, principal protection, income for life, legacy, and long-term care. And if you don't want to solve for any of those four, then you don't need an annuity. So that's kind of my mantra. I do want to talk about, you were mentioning recently, we're on the phone, and you were mentioning there's a research team you're a part of. There's 4 of you.
Yeah.
And it's primarily revolving around portfolio structuring. Tell us about that locked room that you guys are sitting in and what you guys are working on, because that sounds fascinating. That 4 of the brightest people on the planet in this space are talking about portfolio structuring. What are you working on?
Yeah, it's really fun. We just started this team at the beginning of January, and it's several of my longtime Morningstar colleagues. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that at Morningstar, we have these deep teams that are associated with doing individual security research. Mm-hmm. So we've got a team of mutual fund researchers, ETF researchers. We've got a big stock research team. We have fewer people working on financial planning matters, retirement planning, portfolio planning mm-hmm. matters. And it's a very rich territory. And we also find that the community of financial advisors and individual investors, and to some extent the institutional community, really needs the help in some of these areas. I think that we have a lot of financial advisors who came of age in an environment where their secret sauce was, how do I put together an investment portfolio? Mm-hmm. And, what are the specific investments I choose for my clients? Many advisors are recognizing that, yes, perhaps I can add value there, but there are all these other areas where I might add value as well. So internally, we've kind of called them gamma factors. So there's alpha, beta, and there's gamma, where those are all the other levers that you have to improve your plan's outcome. So those would be things like smart Social Security decision making, mm-hmm. How to asset allocate for retirement, what's a safe withdrawal rate in retirement. So we feel like we have a very broad toolkit, which is a little overwhelming, but also super fun. Mm-hmm. And an example of some of the research we've been working on, in the first quarter, we put out a research paper that examined the correlations among various asset classes. And what we concluded was that asset correlations have trended up over the past couple of decades, that we're seeing assets that historically had behaved differently come closer mm-hmm. together. So an example would be real estate equities, REITs. We've mm-hmm. noted that when we look at correlations with the broad equity market, they've come more closely aligned. And so the paper concluded that there are a few asset classes that still do provide really good ballast for equities. It comes down to treasury bonds, really across mm-hmm. the interest rate spectrum, and cash. Those 2 assets generally, if you're looking for something that will zig when your stocks zag, you probably want to ensure that your portfolio includes cash and treasury bonds. So those are the kinds of projects that we're working on. We have also been toiling in the retirement income space, and you'll see some research from us forthcoming on that topic as well.
Last topic that I want to cover with you. It's been fantastic my listeners are just, I'm going to get all the love emails and I'll just forward them to you. But it's been great, and I hope to have you on again. But I wanted to talk to you about your bucket approach. And bucket approach, investing and portfolio, the way you put together the portfolio, this is nothing new. Okay, right. But the bucket approach, it's been used, excuse my French, it's been bastardized, it's been mm-hmm. it's been improperly shown. Can you explain to people the bucket approach and how it might help them with their planning?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Stan. I always say I did not invent the bucket approach. This strategy really came on my radar. I was talking to Harold Avensky, who is a retirement person and professor.
And his wife, Dina Katz. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, they're fantastic. He's out of Texas Tech University. That's where he bases his program. But Harold Avensky is a thought leader, not to interject too much, on just retirement planning as a whole. He's kind of the godfather a little bit.
He is.
And, but Christine's sitting pretty close toward him on all this.
Well,
But yeah,
thank you. You're nice.
but go ahead with that.
Yeah. So I was talking to Harold, gosh, it must have been close to, 12 years ago or so. And I was asking him, I was thinking very much about this yield issue, the fact that yields then were pretty low too. So I was just talking to him about all the dimensions of how he crafts his clients' portfolios. And I asked him that question about, well, like how do you do it, and how do you keep your clients comfortable with portfolios today that, or back then, that should include healthy allocations to equities? And his comment was that, well, I use this kind of bucket system, and I know Harold has evolved a little bit on this view over the years, but basically he said he took 1 to 2 years of his clients' cash flow needs and held it in cash, alongside the total return balanced portfolio that he was running for them. And what he said was that he found that it gave his clients an incredible amount of peace of mind to sit tight with a long-term portfolio, knowing that they knew that their cash flows for the next couple of years were pretty much secured. And he said sometimes he would call his clients on the market's down days and ask, well, how are you feeling about this big market shock? And basically his clients would say, no, I'm okay because I've got this cash buffer, this bucket. And so a light bulb went off in my head because I'm so attuned to the behavioral aspects of all of this. If we optimize a retirement plan, but people can't live with it and it makes them uncomfortable, well, that's not worth anything. We want the plan that people will be able to live with and be comfortable with. And so Harold made the point that doing this gives the clients peace of mind. So that's really led me to provide guidance on how you might sort of incorporate this bucket system into your own plan. And the way I think about it is that you're using maybe 2 years worth of anticipated portfolio withdrawals, and you're holding that money in cash investments. And then from there, you're stepping out on the risk spectrum. So you're holding high quality fixed income investments with the next bucket. So your cash bucket's bucket 1. Bucket 2 would be sort of your high quality bond bucket. And that's holding maybe another 5 to 8 years worth of portfolio withdrawals. And with those 2 buckets, you've effectively built yourself a bulwark that you could spend through if we were talking about sequence of return risk. If you're one of those retirees who walks headlong into a really bad equity market, well, with your buckets 1 and 2, you've given yourself a set of assets that you could spend through and maybe not have to touch your equity holdings for another 10 years, which should give them the opportunity to recover. So that's kind of the basic structure. I know that there are a lot of different variations, but that's how I approach it. And I think it's kind of an intuitive way to visualize what a sane asset allocation for retirement might look like. And it's also just a way to build yourself a portfolio that you could live with and that would give you peace of mind to stick with it, to stick with the long-term investments through various forms of volatility that might materialize.
I'm going to tell you, this has been a great conversation. I know my listeners and viewers have enjoyed it as well. Remember who this is if you don't already know. Christine Benz, she's the Director of Personal Finance for Morningstar and a senior columnist at Morningstar.com. We're going to have her links to her archives on my site. We're going to have the links to her podcast recordings on my site. And I encourage you to start following her if you don't already. Christine, thank you so much for being here. Any final thoughts for the retirees, pre-retirees, or post-retirees that are tuning in?
Well, one thing I always like to say, Stan, is as much as I like to help counsel the DIY type investors, people who have done their own portfolio plans, I would say this is an area where it really helps to get some help, get at least a second set of eyes on your plan to make sure you're just thinking through your own situation. And it may not be that you are, engaging with an advisor where you have to pay him or her forever, but at least get a second set of eyes on that plan to make sure that you're thinking things through. And the other nice thing about engaging some sort of a professional, either on a short-term or a long-term basis, is that you are building in kind of a backup plan, that if something should happen to you, there is someone somewhere who knows kind of the broad contours of whatever plan you were using. I'm a big evangelist for this idea of getting a little bit of help with your plan, even though you're very engaged and might consider yourself very savvy about these matters. Do just get another set of eyes on the plan.
Sage advice from an absolute financial advice superstar and recognized financial advice superstar, Ms. Christine Benz. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor and a privilege, and hope you can join us again soon on the #1 annuity podcast on the planet. And we will see all of you next week on all major podcast platforms and on the Fun with Annuities YouTube channel. Thanks again, Christine Benz.